Welcome boys and girls, Costin here with my High Elf unit tier list for Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires campaigns. With the High Elves, it is a curious situation to talk about them because when you're playing a High Elf campaign, one of the most effective armies that you do have is a combination of spearmen and archers. And pretty much everything that you can recruit in a High Elven campaign, you have to ask the question, is this adding to that kind of army, or is it replacing that kind of army? And that does mean that a lot of the units the High Elves do end up having are not really going to be the most useful to use during the course of a campaign. So first off, we have Ship Company. I think they're a D tier unit. Not a terrible unit, far from it, but most of the time, if there's a choice between Spearmen and Ship Company, I would generally go with Ship Company. The only situation in which you may want to use Ship Company is if you're fighting in water, but even in an Aceland campaign where you do have a lot of those naval encounters, which end up with you fighting on an island, so to speak, many times you will benefit from having Spearmen. And that's kind of the thing about a lot of High Elven infantry units, is like, are they a replacement for Spearmen? If they can complement or replace Spearmen, yes, they're worth bringing. If not, not really so much. And thus we have the humble High Elven Spearmen, which are an S tier unit. They are some of the most effective early game line holders in the game, and they can even hold their own decently well in the late game. Between their survivability, their capability of holding a line in order for your archers to do their job. And that's the thing, when you look at High Elven armies, it's a lot of spearmen and archers that you will want to recruit early on, and then the question is, do you want to replace them? A lot of the time, surprisingly, the answer is no. Then we have Rangers, definitely an F tier unit. It's a squishy early game infantry that has dual wield capability, so you might think it might be useful in some situations, but again, as I've mentioned, when you're playing High Elves, you're most of the time going to want to go Spearmen and Archers, and so Rangers don't really add all that much to that kind of army situation. Then we have Silver and Guard, also an S tier unit. They are basically the unit that replaces Spearmen later on in the campaign. They're just more effective Spearmen. The only downside, of course, is the tier requirement, but basically it's a natural progression path with regards to your unit recruitment. I also like to point out with this list, I'm not going to go over the unique units that individual lords do have. Because when you're playing a Leafanar, you do want to get Shadow Walkers. When you're playing Elfarian, you do want to get his unique units. Those are worth getting pretty much every single one of them. This is more about a generic High Elven army. And speaking about the generic unit, we then have White Lions of Crix. So White Lions, in the lore, they're supposed to be the royal bodyguard, but in the actual game, they're kind of a waste of resources. When you think about a two-handed sword unit, you can think about armored Cossars, you can think about Chaos Warriors with great weapons, hell, you can think about Jade Warriors with halberds. Those units generally have a reason for you to recruit them, a lot of the times. You know, be it with halberds or with grey axes or great swords, you know, Tsarguard with great swords. But when we look at White Lions, they just don't give enough of a combat capability to make them worth recruiting during the course of a campaign. And if you want heavy infantry as the High Elves, you do have the Sword Masters of Hoeth. So when you're looking at Sword Masters, I think they're a B tier unit. I wouldn't rank them in A tier simply because of their tier requirement, and a lot of the time when you're playing High Elves, think of what you're going to be dealing with. I mean, you're going to be dealing with a lot of different races, sure, but with the exception of really techless, you're fighting Dark Elves, you're fighting Slaanesh in Wolf 1, you're fighting Noctilus, those kind of races. Even with Aislin's situation, you just add in Skaven to the mix if, you know, you're going there in, if you're going in Lustria. But outside of that, most of the time, you're kind of fighting a lot of the same foes. I mean, Elfarian, sure, you know, you have greenskins to a degree. Though really, Elfarian doesn't necessarily fight as many greenskins as one might think. He's dealing with Skaven. And Elfarian does have better units for dealing with that from my perspective. Rarely do I see a reason to go out of my way to recruit sort of Masters of Hoeth, but that's just my perspective. Then we have Phoenix Guard, also B tier. Again, not a bad unit. In fact, they're quite great from the perspective of having somewhat of an endgame infantry, though I wouldn't put them at the tier they're at right now. But if you want some heavy infantry, especially, you know, if you're dealing with a lot of endgame cav, for instance, then yeah, you know, Phoenix Guard are useful from that point of view. Then we have archers and archers with light armor. This is a bit of a discussion. So some people argue that you should only recruit archers, regular archers, because archers with light armor are not worth the extra upkeep. But from my perspective, obviously archers, regular archers are pretty damn good. But it's archers with light armor that are going to do better, especially when you're thinking about the auto-resolve situation, and also, of course, from a durability perspective in battles. Just, I think it's worth it. The upkeep is not that much higher. Yes, you do need the barracks, but honestly, that's a small price to pay as the High Elves, especially because when you consider the kind of structures that you can build early on. Sure, you have economic buildings, but just getting one barracks is not going to hurt you a lot. The only reason you get regular archers is if you can't recruit archers with light armor, so that's kind of only relevant in an Elfarian campaign. To some degree, of course, you know, you can talk about techless with building slots and all that, but all the same, I just think, like 99% of the time, you just want to get archers with light armor. Then we have Lodern Seaguard, the baseline version. B tier unit, I mean, you have this hybrid melee ranged unit, but the thing is, in terms of melee capabilities, regular spearmen are better. In terms of range capability, archers are better, and they don't have a shield. Whereas regular Lodern Seaguard do have a shield, so you are sacrificing range capability to give them that melee capability, but getting a couple of these guys to help secure your flanks, especially if you want to maybe maximize your range power output, so you don't get spearmen, instead you get some Lodern Seaguard, especially if you're fighting naval battles. I think they're worth it from that point of view, but not as much, you know, personally I just prefer archers and spearmen, but it can't be argued against that, you know, Lodern Seaguard with shields are a useful unit. Then we have Shadow Warriors. I'm going to put Shadow Warriors in C tier. The reasoning here is that I don't think they're worth it. Like, from a range perspective, yes, you get that skirmisher capability with these guys, but the only campaign in which I actually get Shadow Warriors is Alefanar's campaign, partly because you can recruit them earlier, and yes, you get a combination of Shadow Walkers and Shadow Warriors, but even then, it's only really for Alefanar's own personal army that you really should bother with these guys. Then we have Sisters of Avalorn. So, with Sisters, here's the thing. They are an expensive late-game range unit, but they obviously do a lot of damage against your opponents. The way the High Elf economy ends up working a lot of the times is that it scales up the more you play trade agreements primarily, and that's generally speaking the High Elf experience. You get a lot of heroes. Once you get past the early game, especially with your campaign victory conditions, you get a lot of money. And so with Sisters, the value proposition for the Sisters of Avalorn is you get a really powerful range unit, but it's going to cost a lot more than archers in an army. I think from a combat perspective, they're an A-tier unit, but you look at tier requirements, that's, you know, something of an issue. And then you also consider, you know, upkeep situation. Most of the time, like, the reason I'm not going to put them in S tier is that while the combat capability is definitely there, you might just be better off recruiting more armies with spearmen and archers with light armor. But obviously, it depends on the situation you're dealing with in your campaign. Then we have Eagle Claw Bolt Throwers. I'm going to put them in B tier. They're not a great unit in any way, shape, or form, but they're a necessary unit. So while I obviously won't argue that they deserve an A tier or S tier spot because they're not great units, the primary reason you recruit them is to have an artillery unit in order to deal with enemy fortifications in sieges. You know, 2 or 3 of them to punch a hole in the wall, give line of sight to your archers, because obviously your archers can kill units on the walls, but when you're fighting an Ulthuan especially, Ulthuan fortresses have a lot of towers that cover a lot of angles, so having artillery is pretty damn important. Then we have White Lions, yeah, also an F tier unit. A fast-moving hound unit, basically. That's what White Lions are, and from my view, they're pretty much never worth recruiting in a campaign. If you want a fast-moving unit, you know, you got Chariots, you got Cavalry in a campaign perspective, so I just don't see the value proposition of White Lions. Illyrian Reavers, also an F-tier unit. Like, cavalry-wise, you just have better options that are more durable, will provide more value to an army. Illyrian horse archers, right? So you got horse archers as the high elves. D tier, the only value these guys provide, and it's the only value, like you look at outriders, you look at pistoliers, those can do quite a bit of damage. Like some skirmisher cavalry units can be quite useful from a damage perspective. These guys, their primary value proposition is going to harass an enemy line if they're refusing to engage with you, and that's kind of an important thing for high elves because you want the enemy to come to you into your prepared shooting gallery, really. Then we have Silver Helms. So regular Silver Helms, honestly, like F-tier unit, complete F-tier unit. It's not because they're bad, it's just why would you recruit them when you have Silver Helms with shields, which are just, generally speaking, the better unit to recruit. But even then, with Silver Helms, do you really want them all that much? I'd say with C-tier units, you know, White Lions of Crix, they can be used sometimes if you just want the infantry. Shadow Warriors, you know, if you're willing to spend the money. Silver Helms are a cavalry unit you can recruit relatively early on for high elves. In fact, it might be the only cavalry unit you can recruit that are worth it. But the question is, do you really, really care for them? I mean, think of it. You know, you're dealing with Slaanesh, you're dealing with Dark Elves, hell, even with Greenskins. Are you really going to benefit from getting that cavalry building to recruit Silver Helms? And most of the time, I would say not so much. Then we have Dragon Princes. So Dragon Princes, I'm going to put in B tier. It's just that situation. It's like, yeah, they're an expensive, high-end cavalry unit for the high elves. But by the time you can recruit them, you might have bigger priorities in terms of your unit recruitment. If they were more accessible, and they are, you know, when you're thinking about Emmerich, if they were more accessible, they'd be more useful, but from a tier requirement, not quite as much. Next up, we move on to the chariots of the High Elves, including the flying chariots of the High Elves. First off, we have Turnok chariots, which they're a skirmisher chariot unit. They lose melee capability, force, range capability. I just don't think they're worth really all that much, especially considering what else you can recruit at the same tier as them. and that's kind of a bit of a problem. Then you have Ephelmar chariots. So Ephelmar chariots, they're easy enough to recruit in a campaign, considering how Creative Assembly changed the unit tier requirements. And the main benefit of these chariots is that with high elf chariots in general, you just have that situation where they can get stuck in and disengage because they have few models per unit. And that is a pretty significant advantage. And one of the issues that quite a few chariot units for other races do have, that they have too many entities per unit or too many models per unit. And then, of course, you do have the Lion Chariots of Crix. And Lion Chariots are really ridiculously good. I mean, obviously, they're not as good as Heavy War Sleds of Kislev. But if you want a unit to just charge the flank of an enemy army and do quite a bit of damage and get out, which is quite significant in its own right, then the Lion Chariots are the unit you want to go for. Then we have Skycutters, a flying ranged unit. So their damage capability is not necessarily going to be as great as it should be, but they do have a lot of mobility across the battlefield, and they do have a lot of harassment capability. And that's the thing about Skycutters. You should not underestimate how damn useful these things can be in a battle. While they don't compare to Gyrocopters, far from it, they're still a pretty damn good unit to recruit. It's just, kind of the tier requirements that drag them down a bit. Then we have Skycutters with bolt throwers. While the tier requirement is annoying and does limit how many of them you're realistically going to use in a campaign when it really matters, a flying artillery unit, even if it's just a bolt thrower, is exceptionally useful to have. These guys are, in effect, your Trollhammer torpedoes. Obviously, Trollhammer torpedoes are significantly better as a unit, but they're far more limited, whereas you can recruit however many Skycutters with bolt throwers as you want. Then we have Eagles. Eagles, F-tier unit, never worth recruiting. Their combat capability is just not worth it in a campaign pretty much ever. Phoenixes, I'm going to put both Flaming and Frostfire Phoenixes in C tier. Not terrible units, can do a decent job, but just not really something you want to go out of your way to recruit from my point of view. The Arcane Phoenix, on the flip side, is a different beast. Tier requirements, sure, but still, I'd be remiss if I didn't give it an A tier listing here. Annoying to recruit, definitely, but a fairly competent combat unit that you can get. It's not a dragon, but compared to a dragon, it's much smaller, and that smaller size actually means it's more durable in quite a few situations, especially when you're dealing with range units. If you just want a unit to dive bomb the enemy, this is pretty useful. Then we have Sun Dragons. So Sun Dragons, I really don't see much value proposition in getting them in a campaign. I mean, they're dragons. They'll do a good job in melee, or a pretty decent job when we're talking about Sun Dragons, but they do get eclipsed by Moon Dragons and Star Dragons. So with Moon Dragons, I'm going to put them in B tier. I think they're pretty decent at the job, and realistically, they are the dragon you are most likely to recruit during the course of a campaign, because Star Dragons just require that high tier, except Star Dragons are just a better unit, and that's simply the situation. Just ultimate stats, ultimate attacks, presence on the battlefield. You may not want a lot of Star Dragons, but one or two of them can certainly change the tide of a battle. And what's nice about High Elven Lords is that they do get dragons, and that is quite ridiculous. Oceanids, D-tier unit. Very rarely do I find a use case scenario for them. So from my view, they're just kind of not worth the recruitment in an army. Like, you're just better off getting regular infantry or getting other specialized units than Oceanids. But Sea Elementals, different beast altogether. So Sea Elementals, B tier, not the best unit in the world, but certainly competent enough in combat as, you know, a monstrous entity. Then we have Merworms. So Merworms are a slow, bulky, anti-large unit. Well, not necessarily as slow as, say, something of a rogue idol. Their main value is not really dealing with enemy armies, or, you know, you're talking about infantry or cavalry, anything like that. They're mostly useful to fight big single entities. So they're the best unit you have for that purpose in a High Elven roster. Difficult to get, definitely, and that's the reason I'm not going to put them higher on this list. And they don't have the mobility and general usefulness of, you know, Star Dragon, but ultimately, for that specialized role, they're pretty good. So that's my perspective on the High Elven army, where I think individual units stand. What you want to recruit in most campaigns, really, is Spearmen and Archers, and then Silver and Guard, and that's really going to tackle the vast majority of threats. You can genuinely argue a lot of High Elven units are not particularly relevant as a result of that, unless, you know, you're dealing with some endgame crisis or something along those lines. That's all I had to say. Costin, signing out.